Chapter 1. The Dream Devourer. In the remote village of Ravensbrook, the night lay thick and heavy, an inky shroud blanketing the world. Stars blinked out one by one as dark clouds gathered, promising a storm. The wind whispered through the narrow streets, a soft, mournful sound that echoed through the empty lanes. The villagers had long since retreated to their homes, seeking warmth and safety in their beds, unaware of the sinister presence moving amongst them. In the deepest part of the night, a shadowy figure slinked through the darkness, an indistinguishable blur against the black. The figure moved with a predator's grace, silent and swift, avoiding the sparse light that escaped from the cracks of shuttered windows. It was as if the darkness itself came alive, moving purposefully toward its next target. The figure paused before a modest cottage at the edge of the village. With barely a sound, it slipped through the door, a mere wisp of shadow in the night. Inside, the air was still, the only sound the gentle breathing of the cottage's sole occupant. In her bed, a young woman lay asleep, her face serene in the moonlight filtering through the window. The figure hovered over her, its form indistinct, a haze of malevolent intent. A cold tendril of darkness stretched from the figure, touching the woman's forehead. Her peaceful expression shifted to one of distress, her body tensing as if trapped in a nightmare. The shadow pulsed, feeding, drinking in the vibrant colors of her dreams, leaving nothing but a void behind. As the dawn broke, the shadow receded, vanishing as if it had never been. The woman awoke with a start, her eyes wide with terror. The vivid dreams that had once filled her nights with hope and joy were gone, replaced by an aching emptiness. She could not remember the dreams, only the profound loss they left behind. Days passed, and with each night the shadow returned, draining more and more of her essence. Her once bright eyes grew dull, her laughter faded, replaced by a vacant stare. She wandered the village in a daze, her spirit crushed under the weight of stolen dreams. The villagers noticed the change, but could do nothing. Whispers of curses and dark spirits spread, but no one could help her. Her decline was swift, her mind unraveling as the days blurred into a ceaseless grey. Hope abandoned her, and she sank into a pit of despair. On the fifth night, as the village slept, the woman found herself once again face to face with the shadow. This time, she did not fight. She welcomed the darkness, the numbness, anything to escape the torment of her broken mind. As the shadow drained the last remnants of her hope, she felt a cold, cruel peace. The next morning, the villagers found her lifeless body, a tragic figure of hopelessness and despair. Her death cast a pall over Ravensbrook, a somber reminder of the unseen terror lurking in the night. Whispers grew of the Dream Devourer, a spectral vampire feeding on the dreams and hopes of the innocent, leaving nothing but despair in its wake. The village mourned, but in their sorrow they also feared, for the Dream Devourer was still out there, its hunger insatiable, its presence an unending threat to their peaceful nights. The shadows seemed darker, the nights colder, and hope, once so abundant, was now a precious and fragile thing. As the darkness deepened over Ravensbrook, the villagers clung to what little light remained, praying for a savior, a slayer of the night, to rid them of this unseen plague. But for now, the Dream Devourer roamed free, its next victim unaware of the fate awaiting them in the dead of night. Chapter 2. The Fighter. The roar of the crowd was deafening as Captain Damien Knight found himself pinned against the cage wall in the middle of an MMA arena. His opponent, a hulking brute of a man, had him in a vice-like grip, pummeling him with relentless fists. Each blow sent shockwaves of pain through Damien's body, but his mind was focused, calculating. He took a deep breath, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline. As the next punch came, he looked up at his opponent, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. A slow, confident smile spread across his face. "My turn now," he said, his voice calm and deadly. With a sudden, explosive burst of energy, Damien twisted out of his opponent's grip, his movements a blur. He landed a swift, precise kick to the side of the man's knee, followed by a rapid series of punches to the midsection, and a final, crushing uppercut to the jaw. The brute staggered and then collapsed to the mat, unconscious. The referee rushed in, declaring Damien the winner as the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Damien raised his hand in victory, but his mind was already elsewhere. He made his way out of the ring, the excitement of the fight fading, as he spotted a familiar face waiting for him. "Professor Archer," Damien greeted, nodding to his old friend and confidant. The professor was a tall, slender man with greying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, hidden behind round spectacles. He wore a tweed jacket that seemed out of place in the bustling arena, but the man's demeanor exuded authority and wisdom. "Damien, impressive as always," Professor Archer said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "But we have a more pressing matter to discuss." Damien arched an eyebrow. "What's the situation?" The professor's expression turned serious. "There's been a series of unusual deaths in a village called Ravensbrook. The victims, their mental states deteriorated rapidly. It's as if their dreams and hopes were drained from them, leaving them in a state of utter hopelessness." Damien's casual demeanor vanished. "Dreams and hopes drained?" he asked, a shadow crossing his face. "Are you suggesting?" Professor Archer nodded. "I know it sounds improbable, but the pattern is consistent with vampiric activity, though not of the kind we're familiar with. A vampire that feeds on dreams and hopes. It's a concept I've never encountered before, but scientifically speaking, a vampire is simply a creature that feeds on the living. Blood, life force, age. These are all sustenance to different kinds of vampires. The idea of one feeding on dreams and hopes isn't entirely out of the question." Damien considered this, his mind racing. "So, we're dealing with a new type of vampire?" "Possibly," Archer replied. "The victim's symptoms align with the idea. They were left devoid of any will to live, their minds broken. It's a plausible theory, albeit an unusual one." Damien nodded, his resolve hardening. "To Ravensbrook, then?" Professor Archer placed a hand on his shoulder. "This could be unlike anything we've faced before." Damien flashed a confident grin. "Wouldn't have it any other way, Professor. Let's go." With that, Damien Knight and Professor Archer set out, their destination the dark and haunted village of Ravensbrook, where a new and terrifying enemy awaited. The Night Slayer was on the hunt once more, ready to face whatever darkness lay ahead. Chapter 3. The Awakening. The abandoned swamp near Ravensbrook was a forsaken place, shrouded in mist and silence. Overgrown vegetation choked the area, and stagnant water pooled in dark, murky patches. In the heart of this desolation stood a derelict building, forgotten and decayed with time. Its walls were crumbling, windows shattered, and the air around it seemed thick with an unsettling presence. A woman approached the building, her face obscured by a hood. Her steps were slow and deliberate, as if the weight of her actions pressed heavily upon her. She pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The darkness swallowing her whole. The interior was cold and damp, with the scent of mold and decay lingering in the air. She moved to the center of the room, where the floor was marked with strange symbols and remnants of a long-forgotten ritual. She knelt on the floor, her voice barely a whisper. "It's time again, my child." Time for you to feed. From the cracks in the floor, a thick mist began to rise, swirling and coalescing into a menacing figure. The mist took shape, solidifying into a dark, foreboding presence that loomed over the woman. The figure's eyes glowed with an eerie light, and its form was shadowy and indistinct, like a nightmare made flesh. The woman, the mother, looked up at the figure with a mix of sorrow and determination. "I brought you back," she said, her voice trembling, "after a life of being bullied, put down, and made fun of. A life where you were used, told you were no good, and made to feel worthless. They drove you to take your own life." The figure seemed to listen, its presence oppressive and cold. "From school, all the way to your first job and relationship," the mother continued, tears glistening in her eyes. "They tortured you, but now you will be the one to take back that which they stole from you. They took your dreams and hopes, now you'll steal theirs, so you may live forever." The figure's eyes flared brighter, as if understanding and accepting its purpose. "I enacted the ritual many months ago," she said, her voice breaking. "I paid with my own soul, with the burden of being your keeper. I will guide you, help you feed. But remember, my child, you must be careful. The world will not understand, and they will seek to destroy you." The figure reached out, a cold, shadowy hand caressing the woman's cheek. She shivered, but did not pull away. Instead, she stood, resolved in her mission. "Come, my child, it's time to feed. Time to take back your dreams, to reclaim your hopes, and to live the life they stole from you." As the mother led the menacing figure out of the derelict building, the swamp seemed to grow darker, the mist thicker. The village of Ravensbrook lay ahead, unaware of the terror that was about to befall them. The dream devourer had awakened, and it was hungry. The night was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. The hunt had begun, and Ravensbrook would soon face the wrath of a creature born of despair and nurtured by vengeance. The shadows grew longer, the darkness deeper, as the dream devourer moved ever closer to its unsuspecting prey. Chapter 4. The Investigation. In the dimly lit inn at Ravensbrook, Damien Knight and Professor Archer sat in hushed discussion about the recent events troubling the town. The room was sparsely occupied, with a few locals nursing their drinks in silence. "How would one kill a dream-eating vampire?" Damien asked, leaning forward, his eyes intense. Professor Archer sighed, rubbing his temples. "I am not yet sure. It may be as simple as the old ways: stake, sunlight, holy water, or it could require something we have yet to discover." Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by a man bursting into the inn, his face pale with fear. "There's been another one," he screamed, causing the few occupants of the inn to rise and scramble for safety. Damien swiftly grabbed the man by the shoulders. "Where?" The man pointed towards the outskirts of the village. "A small house just over there." "Let's go, Archer," Damien commanded, and they rushed out into the night. They arrived at a small house, where a local police officer was already on the scene. Damien and Archer entered the house, finding a young woman lying on her bed, a bottle of pills beside her. Immediately, Professor Archer knelt on the floor, first sniffing and then brushing a strange plant along the ground. "Hey, you can't do that," the local officer protested. "Leave him be. He can help," Damien said firmly. "Aha!" Professor Archer exclaimed, holding up the plant, now dead and decayed. "It was here." Damien looked at the victim, noting the tragic scene. "Clearly suicide," the local officer said. "Clearly," Damien echoed, his voice flat. "Who are you? Are you the forensics team?" the officer asked, suspicion in his eyes. "Sort of," Professor Archer replied. "We'll be right back," Damien said, and they left the house. Back in their car, the two drove towards their accommodations. The atmosphere was tense, each lost in their thoughts. "The plant you used, what was it?" Damien asked, breaking the silence. "An old trick," Archer explained. "The plant reacts to supernatural presence. Its life was stolen, decayed. It's a clear indicator of the vampire's path." Damien nodded. "Yes, but this is different. It doesn't kill them directly. It takes their hopes and dreams, diminishes them to a point where the victim gives up and does the job for it." Damien handed his phone to the professor. "What do you make of this?" He had snapped a picture of a small wet patch with mud around it, found by the victim's bedside. Archer examined the image closely. "It's residue. It's common in swamp areas." "Is there a swamp near here?" Damien asked. His voice edged with urgency. The professor looked worried as he answered. "Yes, there is. An old abandoned swamp not far from here." Damien's eyes narrowed. "Then that's where we start. Prepare whatever we might need. We're heading there first thing in the morning." As they drove back to their accommodations, the weight of their mission pressed heavily upon them. Ravensbrook's dark secret was slowly unraveling, and Damien Knight was determined to face the horror that lay in the heart of the swamp. Chapter 5. The Encounter. The early morning sun cast long shadows as Damien Knight opened the boot of his car. At first glance, the trunk appeared empty, but with the click of a button, hidden compartments revealed an array of weaponry: crossbows, stakes, vials of holy water, and other vampire hunting tools gleamed in the dim light. "We'd better take a little of everything," Professor Archer said, peering over Damien's shoulder. "We have no idea what we're up against." Damien nodded, loading a selection of weapons into a sturdy bag. They drove towards the swamp, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. The road grew rougher as they neared the swampy area, the landscape becoming more desolate and overgrown. After a while, they reached the edge of the swamp, where the air was heavy with moisture and the smell of decay. They trekked through the muck, searching for any signs of habitation. Eventually, they came upon an abandoned house, its structure rotting and overrun with vegetation. "This is too easy," Damien muttered. "It's like one of those old black and white horror movies. A swamp, a vampire. What's next? A count?" "Be careful," Professor Archer warned. "What's he going to do to me?" Damien replied with a smirk. They entered the old house, the wooden floorboards creaking under their weight. Professor Archer immediately knelt down, examining the symbols on the floor. "Oh dear, this is bad," he said, his voice filled with concern. Suddenly, a mist began to rise from the cracks in the floor, coalescing into a menacing figure cloaked in darkness. The figure's face was hidden, but its presence was oppressive and cold. The professor backed away as Damien stepped forward. "Look here. You can't go around eating people's dreams and hopes. You're causing a terrible fuss," Damien said, his tone mocking. Without warning, the creature swooped down on Damien, attempting to feed on his dreams. Damien looked up at the figure, unperturbed. He pulled back a scarf covering his neck, revealing a huge bite mark, clearly the result of a vampire's bite. "Sorry, but that's already been done," he said, smirking. Damien thrust a stake into the figure, but nothing happened. "Not stakes!" Damien shouted, frustration evident in his voice. The professor, thinking quickly, threw a small bottle at Damien. Damien caught it and splashed the liquid over the creature, but again, nothing happened. Not holy water. All the while, the creature and Damien struggled, the creature growing increasingly confused as to why it could not siphon Damien's dreams. "What is this?" the creature hissed, its voice a chilling whisper. Why can't I feed? Let's just say I'm not your average meal. Damien replied, his eyes flashing with determination. Archer, any bright ideas? The professor, still searching the room for clues, suddenly stopped. Damien, the symbols on the floor, they're part of an ancient protection spell. If we can activate it, we might be able to trap the creature. Do it, Damien ordered, holding the creature at bay. Professor Archer quickly began to chant, his voice steady and clear. The symbols on the floor started to glow faintly, and the mist around the creature began to waver. You're not going anywhere, Damien said, his grip tightening on the creature. Not until we figure out how to end you. With the professor's chanting reaching a crescendo, the creature let out a furious scream. The glowing symbols on the floor formed a barrier, trapping the creature within. It won't hold forever, Archer warned. We need to find a way to destroy it. Damien nodded, his eyes never leaving the struggling creature. We'll figure it out, but for now, it's contained. The creature snarled, its eyes burning with hatred. You cannot stop me. I will feed and I will grow stronger. Not if we have anything to say about it, Damien replied, his voice resolute. As the sun rose higher, two men stood over the trapped creature, knowing that their battle was far from over. They had taken the first step, but the path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty. But Damien Knight was not one to back down. The hunt had just begun, and he was ready for whatever came next. Chapter 6. The Trap. Damien Knight and Professor Archer stood over the trapped creature, its dark form seething within the glowing barrier of ancient symbols. They had tried everything in their arsenal: stakes, holy water, silver, and even fire. But nothing seemed to harm the entity. It merely laughed, its sinister voice echoing in the decaying room. This is strange, Professor Archer muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. None of the conventional methods are working. Damien frowned, pacing around the creature. There must be something we're missing. You said it feeds on dreams and hopes. Maybe we need to attack it on that level. The professor's eyes lit up with sudden inspiration. Of course, there are ancient legends about dream catchers. Talismans used to capture and filter dreams. If we can find or create a powerful enough dream catcher, we might be able to drain its power. Damien nodded. Do you have the materials to make one? Professor Archer rummaged through his bag, pulling out a few items. A small circular frame, some string, and a handful of feathers and beads. This is a makeshift version, but it might just work if we imbue it with the right intent. Working quickly, the professor crafted the dream catcher, chanting softly under his breath. As he finished, the dream catcher glowed faintly with a soft, ethereal light. Here goes nothing, Damien said, holding the dream catcher towards the creature. As the dream catcher approached the barrier, the creature began to writhe and scream. Tendrils of dark mist started to seep from its form, drawn towards the talisman. The dream catcher absorbed the mist, glowing brighter with each passing second. It's working! Professor Archer exclaimed, relief evident in his voice. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the woman from the swamp entered in a frenzy. No! I will not let you take my child, she screamed, rushing towards them. Damien reacted instantly, his fist connecting with the woman's jaw. She collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Oh, I thought she was one of them, but she's normal. Sort of, Damien said, shaking his head. Quickly, finish the ritual, the professor urged, focusing on the task at hand. They continued to hold the dream catcher close to the creature, chanting words of power. The entity's form grew weaker and more translucent. its essence being drained into the glowing talisman. The creature's screams faded into a pitiful whimper as it dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only a faint trace of mist. "It's done," Damien said, lowering the Dreamcatcher. "The creature is gone." Professor Archer knelt beside the woman, checking her pulse. "She's alive, but unconscious. She was his mother, the one who brought him back." Dreamcatcher, now pulsing with a dark energy. "We need to destroy this. Make sure nothing like this happens again." The professor nodded. "Agreed. We'll take it back to my lab and study it, then find a way to neutralize it permanently." As they left the abandoned house, the sun began to rise, casting a golden light over the swamp. Ravensbrook could finally breathe a sigh of relief, unaware of the battle that had taken place to save their hopes and dreams. But for Damien Knight and Professor Archer, the fight was never truly over. They knew that other creatures lurked in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike, and they would be ready, always prepared to face the darkness and protect the light. Chapter 7. The Gift. Back in the lab, the air was filled with the hum of machines and the soft glow of computer screens. Damien Knight stood by a workbench, holding a small, tarnished locket. He opened it, revealing a picture of a woman and a child, their faces radiating happiness and love. He traced his finger over their images, his expression one of deep sorrow and determination. Professor Archer glanced up from his work, noticing Damien's reflective state. "They are proud of you, my friend," he said gently. "What you do for others, something no one else could do." Damien didn't respond immediately. His mind drifted back to that fateful night, a flashback overwhelming his senses. It was a peaceful night in their home. Damien and his wife Emily lay asleep in their bed, the soft sounds of their breathing mingling with the night air. In the next room, their 6-year-old son, Tommy, slept soundly, clutching his favorite toy. Suddenly, a noise shattered the tranquility. A scream. Damien jolted awake, instantly alert. He dashed to Tommy's room, his heart pounding. He burst through the door to find a vampire looming over his son, its fangs bared. Tommy's terrified eyes met his father's, just as the vampire struck, sinking its teeth into his small neck. Emily's scream echoed through the house as she ran in, desperately reaching for Tommy. The vampire moved with lightning speed, biting her and draining her life force in an instant. Damien, a decorated MMA champion and honored military veteran, lunged at the creature with all his might. The vampire turned and bit deeply into Damien's neck, leaving him for dead as it vanished into the night. Back in the lab, Damien's hand instinctively touched the scar on his neck. He had recovered, but not as a normal man. He had survived with some traits and strengths of vampires, but none of their weaknesses. He didn't need to drink blood or hide from sunlight. His senses were heightened, and his strength, recovery, and speed were accelerated beyond human limits. The professor's voice brought him back to the present. "You, my friend, have been given a gift for a reason. No other man could have survived a vampire bite, but you did. You survived for one reason, to ensure no one else needs to suffer as you did." Damien closed the locket and put it in his pocket, his eyes hardening with resolve. "I won't let their deaths be in vain, Archer. I will hunt down every last one of these monsters and make sure no one else loses their family." Professor Archer nodded, his expression a mix of respect and sadness. "Your pain drives you, Damien. But remember, it's also your humanity that sets you apart. You fight not just for vengeance, but for the hope and dreams of those who can't fight for themselves." Damien's eyes met Archer's, a silent understanding passing between them. "Thank you, Archer, for everything." The professor smiled faintly. "No need to thank me. We're in this together, Now, let's figure out how to neutralize this dream catcher. We can't afford to have another dream devourer arise. As they turned back to their work, the weight of the past still heavy on Damien's shoulders, he knew that his mission was far from over. But with the Professor by his side, and the memories of his loved ones driving him forward, he was ready to face whatever darkness lay ahead. Chapter 8. The Next Threat. There, that should do it, said Professor Archer, as the glow from the Dreamcatcher dimmed and went out. He set the now inert talisman down with a sigh of relief. Just at that moment, his phone buzzed with a new message. "No time to relax. We got another one," the Professor said, glancing at Damien. "Already?" Captain Knight replied, eyebrows raised. "Yes, something about madness. Several victims, seemingly normal, suddenly losing their minds. Something's draining their sanity," explained the Professor, his voice tense. "There's that word again. Draining. So it must be one of them," Damien said, his jaw tightening. "Yes," replied the Professor, his eyes meeting Damien's with a mixture of determination and concern. Join Captain Damien Knight and Professor Archer as they fight against the world of vampiric creatures. These are not always the creatures of legend, but entities that drain their victims in various insidious ways. Each episode pits our heroes against strange and terrifying vampiric beings. Will they be able to counter these bizarre threats, or will they fall to the powers of the vampire? Stay tuned for part 2, coming soon. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the lab, Damien and the Professor prepared for their next mission. The fight against the darkness was far from over, and with each new threat, they knew the stakes would only get higher. But together, they were ready to face whatever horrors awaited them. The Night Slayer's journey continued, and the battle against the vampiric scourge would not cease until every last one was vanquished. It's Professor Shadow here. If you love diving into the shadows with me, then you definitely don't want to miss any of my videos. And make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell icon so you never miss out on our next adventure. Your support helps us keep exploring the unknown and uncovering the mysteries together. Chapter 1. The Madness Vampire. The village of Holt in Norfolk, UK, was a picturesque place, known for its charming streets and serene countryside. But as night fell, a shadow moved through the quiet lanes, unseen and unheard. This was no ordinary shadow. It was a harbinger of madness, a vampire that fed not on blood, but on the sanity of its victims. In a modest cottage on the outskirts of the village, a middle-aged man named Harold Martin lay asleep. His life had been one of routine and quiet contentment, but recently, his nights had become haunted by disturbing dreams. Each time he closed his eyes, he was drawn into a nightmarish realm where a dark figure lurked, slipping into his subconscious and draining his sanity bit by bit. Harold's eyes fluttered open in the middle of the night, his body drenched in sweat. He sat up, gasping for breath, his heart pounding against his ribs. The dreams were getting worse, more vivid and terrifying. He could barely recall the details, only the feeling of a presence. dark and malevolent, feeding on his mind. Days turned into weeks, and Harold's condition deteriorated. He became irritable and paranoid, his once bright eyes now clouded with fear and confusion. He stopped going to the local pub, stopped greeting his neighbours. The isolation only deepened his descent into madness. One evening, as the sun set and the village was bathed in twilight, Harold sat in his living room, staring blankly at the television. The images on the screen seemed to blur and twist, a reflection of his fractured mind. He tried to stay awake, knowing that sleep would bring the vampire back, but exhaustion claimed him. In his dream, the vampire appeared again, its form shifting and indistinct. It whispered to Harold, filling his mind with dark thoughts and unrelenting fear. The creature thrived on his terror, growing stronger as Harold's sanity slipped away. The line between dream and reality began to blur, and Harold couldn't tell if he was awake or still trapped in the nightmare. His behavior grew more erratic. He ranted about shadows and whispers, about eyes watching him from the darkness. His friends and neighbors tried to help, but nothing could reach him through the haze of madness. He was lost, a prisoner of his own mind, and the vampire's grip tightened with each passing night. One fateful night, Harold woke up screaming, his body convulsing with fear. He stumbled out of bed, running through the darkened house, tearing at his hair. The walls seemed to close in on him, the shadows mocking his desperation. In his mind, he heard the vampire's voice, taunting him, driving him to the brink of insanity. Unable to take it any longer, Harold ran out of his house into the cold night, screaming for help. His cries echoed through the village, but no one came. They had grown used to his outbursts, dismissing them as the ravings of a madman. But Harold's screams were not in vain. They reached the ears of Captain Damien Knight and Professor Archer, who had just arrived in Norfolk. Following reports of mysterious cases of madness, they exchanged a grim look, knowing that their hunt had just begun. The vampire had chosen its prey well, but it had not accounted for the tenacity and skill of the Night Slayer and his trusted ally. As they prepared to face this new threat, they knew that the battle for Harold's sanity and the safety of the entire village was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Asylum's Curse. In the grim and shadowed halls of Blackwood Asylum, built in the 1800s, the cries of the tormented echoed through the cold stone walls. It was a place where society's unwanted were sent to be forgotten, where madness was treated with cruelty rather than compassion. The methods used to treat insanity were barbaric, often causing more harm than good. Restraints, ice baths, and electroshock therapy were common, leaving patients broken and lost. Among the asylum's unfortunate residents was an old man named Ezekiel Thorne. Once a respected landowner in Holt, Norfolk, Ezekiel had been accused of madness by his own family. They coveted his land and wealth and had him committed to the asylum to seize his property. He was dragged away, screaming that he was sane, but his cries fell on deaf ears. As the staff forced him into a cell, "I am not mad. My family did this to me for my land." The staff exchanged weary glances. "That's what they all say," one of the attendants muttered, shaking his head. Ezekiel's treatment was harsh and relentless. They used restraints to bind him, ice baths to shock his system, and crude electrotherapy to subdue his protests. Each session left him more despondent, more disconnected from the reality he desperately clung to. One day, they subjected Ezekiel to a particularly brutal session. They tied him to a chair, placed a metal helmet on his head, and administered powerful electric shocks. His screams were heart-wrenching, echoing through the asylum, but the staff remained unmoved. As the shocks coursed through his body, Ezekiel's cries turned to desperate pleas. "I'll make you all pay for this," he shouted, his voice filled with rage and pain, but his threats were ignored, seen as the ravings of a madman. The treatments continued until Ezekiel was reduced to a docile, unresponsive state. He sat in his cell, staring blankly at the walls, a shell of the man he once was. His spirit broken, he no longer fought against his captors. Years passed, and Ezekiel Thorne faded into obscurity, his story forgotten by the world, but his curse lingered, a dark presence that would eventually resurface. The madness that consumed him did not die with his body. It lingered, festering in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Ezekiel's story was a dark chapter in the history of Holt, a tale of greed, betrayal, and suffering. The echoes of his pain and rage seeped into the very fabric of the village, lying dormant, waiting for a chance to exact revenge. Chapter 3. The Hospital. Captain Damien Knight and Professor Archer stood in the sterile, dimly lit corridor of the local hospital, the beeping of machines and muffled voices creating a tense backdrop. They had followed the ambulance that had rushed Harold Martin to the hospital, hoping to find some answers about the strange madness that had claimed him. As they waited outside the emergency room, an older doctor approached them, his expression weary but kind. "You must be the ones asking about Harold Martin." "Yes," Damien replied. "We need to know what happened to him. His condition seemed unnatural." The doctor nodded, his eyes reflecting a hint of recognition. "Harold was my patient, and I knew his grandfather. In fact, Harold's great-grandfather was a doctor here many years ago. He was one of the founders of this hospital." Professor Archer's curiosity was piqued. "His great-grandfather? Could you tell us more about him?" The doctor gestured for them to follow. "Come with me. There's something you should see." They walked through the hospital corridors until they reached a large, ornate painting on the wall. It depicted a stern-looking man standing proudly in front of Blackwood Asylum. The plaque beneath the painting read, "Dr. Charles Martin, founder of Blackwood Asylum and Holt General Hospital." Dr. Charles Martin was a significant figure in this community, the older doctor explained. He helped establish both the asylum and this hospital. Unfortunately, his legacy is tainted by the methods used in the asylum. It was a place of great suffering. Damien and Archer exchanged a glance, understanding the gravity of this new connection. At that moment, a nurse approached them, her face grave. "I'm sorry to inform you, but Harold Martin has passed away. His mind, he just gave up." Damien's jaw tightened. "Thank you for letting us know," he said to the nurse before turning to Professor Archer. "We need to check out that asylum. There's something there, something connected to all of this." The doctor overheard their conversation and added, "Be careful. The asylum has been abandoned for many years, but its history is dark and filled with sorrow." Damien nodded. "We will. Thank you, Doctor." As they left the hospital, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. Harold's great-grandfather, Dr. Charles Martin. The connection between the past and the present was becoming clearer, and the path led straight to the forsaken halls of Blackwood Asylum. With determination in their hearts and the weight of history on their shoulders, Damien Knight and Professor Archer prepared for their next move. The truth behind the madness awaited them, and they would stop at nothing to uncover it. Chapter 4. The Phantom's Vengeance. The village of Holt lay shrouded in darkness, the night air thick with an eerie silence. Shadows danced along the cobbled streets, cast by the flickering lamplights. Among these shadows, a single entity moved with a ghostly grace, its presence almost imperceptible. This was no ordinary being. It was the spirit of Ezekiel Thorne, a vengeful wraith searching for retribution. The figure glided through the village, its form shifting and blending with the night. it arrived at a piece of land that had once belonged to Ezekiel Thorne, a sprawling estate, now reduced to a single modern home. The land had been sold off years ago by Ezekiel's relatives, who had betrayed him for the promise of wealth. The spirit paused outside the house, its ethereal form barely visible in the moonlight. Through the window, it watched a family gathered around the dining table, their laughter and warmth filling the room. A father, mother, and 2 children sat together, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the chandelier. The happiness they shared was palpable, a stark contrast to the torment Ezekiel had endured. For a brief moment, the spirit's malevolent aura seemed to waver. A faint smile crossed its shadowy visage, a remnant of the humanity it once possessed. These were not the people who had wronged him. They were innocent, their joy untouched by the darkness of the past. The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. The spirit turned away from the window, leaving the family undisturbed. Its purpose was clear, and its path was set. It sought out those who had betrayed it, those who had condemned Ezekiel to a life of madness and suffering. As it moved through the village, the spirit's presence grew colder, the air around it thick with an unnatural chill. It remembered the faces of those who had wronged it, the greed and deceit that had led to its downfall. The descendants of these traitors still lived in Holt, their bloodlines tainted by the sins of their ancestors. The spirit searched the night, its senses keen and unrelenting. It knew where to find them, drawn to the echoes of their malevolent deeds. Each step it took brought it closer to its goal, the thirst for vengeance burning brightly within its spectral heart. The village was unaware of the darkness that stalked its streets, the phantom of Ezekiel Thorne, driven by a rage that spanned generations. It was a being torn between the remnants of its humanity and the all-consuming desire for revenge. As the night deepened, the spirit's search continued. The laughter and warmth it had witnessed were distant memories, overshadowed by the haunting visions of its own torment. The time for reckoning was at hand, and the phantom would not rest until those who had wronged it paid the ultimate price. The villagers of Holt slept soundly in their beds, oblivious to the danger that lurked in the shadows. But for those whose bloodlines were marked by betrayal, the night held a different kind of terror, a terror that would soon be unleashed upon them by the vengeful spirit of Ezekiel Thorne. Chapter 5. Confrontation at the Inn. Professor Archer sat in a corner of the inn, surrounded by a sea of ancient texts and his trusty laptop. His fingers danced across the keyboard as he delved deeper into the history of Blackwood Asylum. The more he read, the more appalled he became at the brutal methods employed by the so-called doctors of the past. Barbaric, Archer muttered to himself. These so-called doctors were nothing short of monsters. Just then, a burly, tough-looking man bumped into Archer, knocking his laptop slightly off balance. "Watch where you're going, old man," the thug growled, his voice dripping with menace. "I beg your pardon," Archer said, adjusting his glasses. "But wasn't it you who just collided with me?" At that moment, 3 other men stood up from a nearby table, all with the same thuggish demeanor. "You need to watch your manners, old man," one of them sneered. Before the situation could escalate further, Damian Knight stood up from his seat at the bar, his presence commanding immediate attention. "This old one isn't worth your time," he said, his voice calm and steady. "How about we settle this outside? Just you 4 and me." The thugs exchanged glances, and sensing an opportunity, followed Damian out of the inn. The cool night air greeted them as they stepped into the dimly lit alleyway behind the inn. One of the thugs, brimming with overconfidence, charged at Damian. With reflexes that were almost superhuman, Damien sidestepped the attack with ease. "Look," Damien said, his voice carrying a hint of warning. "Obviously, someone has put you up to this. What they haven't told you is that I'm going to make this very painful, unless you tell me who." The four men, undeterred by Damien's words, charged at him simultaneously, but Damien was ready. Moving with speed and power that defied human limits, he dodged their blows effortlessly. In a blur of motion, he struck each thug with precision, knocking them all to the ground in seconds. One of the men, dazed and terrified, awoke to find Damien shaking him gently but firmly. "Let's you and me have a little talk," Damien said, his eyes boring into the thug's soul. The man's bravado crumbled under Damien's intense gaze. "We were paid to beat up the old man and you," he stammered, fear evident in his eyes. "Who paid you?" Damien demanded, his grip tightening slightly. "The Thorn family," the thug blurted out. "It was the Thorn family." Damien released the man, who scrambled away, clutching his bruised ribs. He turned to Professor Archer, who had followed them outside. "Looks like we've stirred up a hornet's nest, Archer. The Thorn family seems to have a lot at stake here." Archer nodded, his expression grim. "Indeed. But who are the Thorns, and why are they so desperate to keep us away?" Damien pondered this new information. "We need to dig deeper into this Thorn family and their connection to Blackwood Asylum. There's something they're hiding, and it's our job to find out what it is." With renewed determination, Damien and Archer prepared for their next move. The confrontation with the thugs had only strengthened their resolve to uncover the truth behind the Thorn family's dark secrets and the madness that plagued Holt. The hunt for answers continued, and they were ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. Chapter 6. The Asylum's Darkness. The trail led Damien Knight and Professor Archer to the foreboding structure of Blackwood Asylum. The building loomed in the night, its windows like dark, empty eyes watching their every move. With a shared glance of determination, they stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The air was heavy with dust and the lingering echoes of past suffering. The walls were lined with the remnants of old decaying medical equipment and yellowed papers strewn across the floor. They made their way to the center, where Archer began to prepare a ritual to summon the entity they were hunting. Archer drew a circle on the floor with chalk, placing candles at its edges and lighting them one by one. He chanted in a low, ominous voice, invoking ancient words meant to draw the spirit from its hiding place. The atmosphere grew colder, and the shadows seemed to pulse and writhe around them. As the ritual reached its peak, a dark mist began to gather in the center of the circle. It swirled and coalesced into a form, solidifying into the twisted, parasitic figure of Ezekiel Thorn. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and his presence exuded an aura of pure madness. "You dare summon me?" Ezekiel hissed, his voice a chilling whisper that seemed to echo in their minds. "I must feed on sanity to live, to complete my mission." Damien stepped forward, his expression resolute. "I can't allow this to continue." Ezekiel laughed, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. "You cannot stop me," he said, and with a sudden, forceful movement, he reached out and entered Damien's mind. Despite his vampiric abilities, Damien felt an overwhelming surge of madness and despair. He began to crumble, his mind assaulted by chaotic visions and the echoing screams of the insane. Archer, seeing his friend in distress, grabbed him and dragged him out of the circle. Once outside the asylum, Damien's mind began to clear. He took deep, steadying breaths and slowly regained his composure. "We can't fight him directly," he admitted, frustration evident in his voice. Archer nodded. "I have another plan, but first we need to pay the Thorns a visit." after recovering from their encounter, made their way to the Thorn residence, a modest farm home on a small piece of private land, the last remnant of Ezekiel Thorn's estate. They approached cautiously, the night cloaking their movements. Damien sneaked onto the grounds, his keen eyes noticing strange symbols carved into the earth and stones around the home. He took photos of the symbols with his phone and returned to Archer, showing him the images. "Of course," Archer said, realization dawning on his face. "These are protection symbols. They're designed to keep something out and keep the family safe." Quickly looking up information on his laptop, Archer found an old record. Ezekiel Thorn, a patient of the asylum. This was his land. They claimed he was mad, but was he? Damien frowned. "What are you suggesting?" Archer looked up from his screen. "We need to remove the symbols." Damien objected. "We need to find a way to stop this thing, not just expose the family to danger." Archer shook his head. "This is how we stop it. The symbols are keeping Ezekiel's spirit out, but they're also keeping us from fully confronting and dealing with him. If we remove them, we can draw him here and find a way to end this." Damien hesitated, but then nodded. "All right, let's do it, but we need to be prepared for anything." With a shared look of determination, they set about their task. The night was far from over, and the true battle against Ezekiel Thorn was just beginning. Chapter 7. Unveiling the Truth. As Damien set off to remove the symbols around the Thorn residence, Professor Archer continued his research on his laptop. The Thorn family history was elusive, shrouded in secrecy. However, Archer managed to uncover a long lineage of corruption, a family marked by harshness and cruelty. Stories of beatings, mistreatment of servants, and other acts of cruelty painted a grim picture of a family almost cursed by their own actions. A short time later, Damien returned, his expression grim. "I got all the ones I could find." Archer looked up, concern etched on his face. "I think we may have just condemned them all to madness." Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed through the night. Damien and Archer rushed towards the Thorn home, their hearts pounding. By the time they arrived, it was too late. The aging members of the Thorn family lay on the floor, lifeless. The protection symbols had kept Ezekiel out, but with them removed, his vengeance had been unleashed. "Look out!" screamed Archer as Ezekiel Thorn's spectral figure materialized before them. Damien prepared to fight, but a calm voice halted his movements. It was the voice of Ezekiel Thorn. "Stop," Ezekiel said, his tone surprisingly serene. "My vengeance is now sated." Damien and Archer stood still, listening intently. Ezekiel continued, "My family sent me to the asylum to steal my land and fortune. They declared me mad to rid themselves of me. Their greed drove them to betray their own blood." He glanced at the fallen Thorns, his expression one of sadness rather than anger. "The current family knew of the curse I placed upon them, and those at the asylum. They dabbled in black magic to keep me out and hide from my sight, continuing the legacy of evil through their greed." Ezekiel's eyes met Damien's. "I no longer seek vengeance. I will now rest in peace. I have fed all I need to feed. I will be a permanent part of the asylum. Do not come there. Should anyone disturb my rest, I will destroy them, for no one can stop madness." With that, Ezekiel's form began to fade, a peaceful smile spreading across his face. The air around them grew still, the oppressive weight of his presence lifting. Damien and Archer stood in silence, processing what they had just witnessed. The dark legacy of the Thorn family had come to an end, and Ezekiel's spirit was finally at peace. "Let's go," Damien said quietly. "Our work here is done." They left the Thorn residence. the night air now feeling lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted from the village of Holt. As they walked away, the outline of Blackwood Asylum loomed in the distance, a silent reminder of the darkness that once resided there. Ezekiel Thorne's warning echoed in their minds. The asylum was now a resting place for a tormented spirit, one that demanded to be left alone, knew they had to respect his final wish, but their journey was far from over. The world was full of darkness and creatures that preyed on the innocent, and they would continue their fight against it. For now, though, they had brought peace to one tormented soul and ended a cycle of vengeance and madness. The night was still, and the promise of a new dawn gave them hope for the battles yet to come. The Night Slayer, Episode 3, The Time Eater, Chapter 1. In a brightly lit Brazilian jiu-jitsu school, Captain Damien Knight was in the midst of an intense training session. Sweat glistened on his forehead as he grappled with his BJJ professor, an older man with a wealth of experience and skill. Despite Damien's enhanced abilities and strength, the professor's technique was impeccable. With a swift and precise movement, the BJJ professor caught Damien in a chokehold, expertly locking it in. Damien struggled to escape, but the grip was too tight, the technique too perfect. After a few moments, he tapped out, signaling his submission. "You rely too much on your power and strength, Damien," the professor said, his voice calm but firm. "Technique always trumps brute force." Damien nodded, breathing heavily as he got to his feet. "I understand, Professor. Thank you for the lesson." After showering and changing, Damien left the school, deep in thought about the advice he had just received. He knew there was truth in the professor's words. His strength and abilities were formidable, but they could only take him so far without proper technique. Later that day, Damien met up with Professor Archer at their usual spot, a quiet cafe that served as their makeshift headquarters for planning and strategizing. "From one professor to another," Damien said with a grin. "At least you won't be choking me, Archer." Professor Archer looked up from his laptop, a serious expression on his face. "Maybe not, but this information might." Intrigued, Damien sat down and leaned in as Archer turned the laptop toward him. "I've been looking into some unusual case studies from a remote town in Europe," Archer began. "There have been reports of victims suddenly aging overnight. It's as if their time is being stolen." Damien's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. "A vampire?" Archer nodded. "It certainly looks that way. The victims are left as withered husks, completely drained of their youth and vitality. I've cross-referenced the data with historical records, and it matches the pattern of a creature known as the Time Eater." Damien leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "If this vampire is out there, we need to stop it before it claims more victims." "Agreed," Archer said. "But we need to be cautious. This vampire's ability to consume time makes it incredibly dangerous. We can't afford any mistakes." Damien's resolve hardened. "Then let's get to work. We need to gather all the information we can and prepare for whatever comes our way." As they began to plan their next steps, the gravity of their mission settled over them. The fight against the Time Eater would be their most challenging yet, but Damien and Archer were determined to face it head on. The night was their battleground, and they would not rest until the vampire was stopped. Chapter 2. The small town of Hallstatt, nestled in the Austrian Alps, was known for its picturesque landscapes and serene atmosphere. However, as night fell, the quaint streets took on an eerie silence, the peaceful facades casting long, sinister shadows. A young man named Lucas was making his way home from a night out with friends. The cobblestone streets were deserted, the only sound his footsteps echoing in the cold, crisp air. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, feeling the seclusion and darkness pressing in from all sides. As Lucas turned a corner into a particularly dark and narrow alley, he noticed a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a young woman, her beauty striking and her presence captivating. She seemed out of place, her elegance contrasting sharply with the gloom surrounding them. "Hello," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "Are you lost?" Lucas, taken aback by her sudden appearance, shook his head. "No, just on my way home. What about you? It's not safe to be out here alone." She smiled, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "I could say the same to you. Mind if I walk with you for a bit?" He nodded, unable to resist her charm. As they walked together, Lucas found himself entranced by her presence. They talked, casually, her laughter a soothing melody that put him at ease despite the dark surroundings. However, as they ventured deeper into the darkness, the atmosphere grew colder, more oppressive. Suddenly, without warning, a scream pierced the night. The alley was plunged into an even deeper darkness, swallowing the pair from view. Moments later, a horrific sight emerged from the shadows. Lucas, now a withered, ancient figure, lay on the ground, his life force drained away. His once youthful features were now those of a man over 100 years old. He gasped for breath, his eyes wide with terror and pain. With great effort, Lucas crawled from the darkness, his aged hands clutching the cobblestones. His face, now a mask of death, contorted with agony as he tried to call for help. He managed a few feeble breaths before collapsing completely, the life snuffed out of him. The beautiful woman watched from the shadows, her eyes cold and devoid of the warmth they had shown earlier. She turned and disappeared into the night, leaving behind the lifeless, aged husk of Lucas. The town of Hallstatt remained unaware of the terror lurking in its shadows, but the Time Eater was already seeking its next victim. The darkness held its secrets tightly, but Damien Knight and Professor Archer were on their way, determined to uncover the truth and stop the vampire before it could claim more lives. Chapter 3. Damien Knight and Professor Archer stood at the scene of Lucas's death, the cold night air thick with tension. The local police had cordoned off the area, and the body had been taken away, but the lingering sense of dread remained. Damien and Archer spoke with a group of officers, trying to piece together what had happened. An older police officer, with a weathered face and a somber expression, stepped forward to address them. "This isn't the first time this has happened," he said, his voice tinged with resignation. Damien's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" The officer sighed, rubbing his temples. "There have been other cases. People found dead, aged beyond their years. It's as if their time was stolen from them." Professor Archer leaned in, intrigued. "Do you have any idea what could be causing this?" The older officer hesitated before speaking. "There's an old legend about a family from years gone by. It dates back to the time of the Napoleonic Wars. The story goes that a wife, desperate to bring her husband back after he was killed in battle, made a pact to resurrect him. She succeeded, but he came back different. From then on, he had to feed on the lives and time of others to remain alive." Damien listened intently. "And what happened to him?" "Legend says a brave hunter managed to kill him many years ago," the officer replied. "But there are whispers that either he has come back, or one of his descendants carries the same curse." Professor Archer quickly pulled out his laptop, diving into the historical records and old folklore. "We need to find out more about this family," he said, his fingers flying over the keyboard. As Archer sifted through the digital archives, a strange figure watched from the shadows, its presence barely perceptible, The figure's eyes glinted with an eerie light as it observed the conversation, listening to every word exchanged between the officers and the two men. "Here it is," Archer said, his eyes lighting up as he found a reference. The family name was von Hohenberg. They were a prominent family in this region until they mysteriously vanished. Damien nodded, absorbing the information. "We need to find out if there are any living descendants or any trace of this family left." The older officer added, "There's an old estate on the outskirts of town. It belonged to the von Hohenberg family. No one goes there anymore. It's said to be haunted." Damien's jaw tightened with determination. "Then that's where we'll start." Unbeknownst to them, the figure in the shadows slipped away, disappearing into the night. The Time Eater was aware of their presence, and it would not let its secrets be uncovered so easily. As Damien and Archer prepared to head to the old von Hohenberg estate, they knew they were venturing into a place steeped in dark history and powerful curses. The fight against the Time Eater was just beginning, and they had to be ready for anything. Chapter 4. The early 19th century was a time of great upheaval and conflict in Europe. The Napoleonic Wars raged across the continent, leaving destruction and death in their wake. One of the many battles fought during this period was the Battle of Wagram, a fierce and bloody conflict between Napoleon's forces and the Austrian Empire. On the battlefield, soldiers clashed with swords and muskets, the air thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded. Among the Austrian soldiers was a brave man from the von Hohenberg estate, a nobleman who fought valiantly for his country. His name was Friedrich von Hohenberg, and he was known for his courage and skill in combat. Friedrich fought with all his might, leading his men with a combination of strategy and sheer will. But amidst the chaos of battle, he was struck down, a fatal wound ending his life. His body was carried back to his estate, where his wife Isolde awaited with a heart full of grief and desperation. Isolde was inconsolable, her sorrow driving her to the brink of madness. Unable to accept her husband's death, she turned to ancient texts and forbidden rituals. She made a pact with supernatural forces, willing to do anything to bring Friedrich back to life. In the dead of night, under a full moon, Isolde performed the ritual. She invoked dark powers, offering her own soul in exchange for her husband's return. The air around her crackled with dark energy as she chanted the incantations, her voice echoing through the silent halls of the von Hohenberg estate. Friedrich's lifeless body began to stir, a faint glow enveloping him. Slowly he rose, his eyes opening to reveal a new, unearthly light. He was alive, but not as he had been before. His skin was pale, his eyes hollow, and a deep hunger gnawed at his soul. He had been brought back, but he was no longer truly human. To survive, he needed to feed on the life essence and time of younger people, draining them of their vitality to sustain his own. For years, Friedrich lived in the shadows, preying on the innocent to maintain his cursed existence. His once noble deeds were forgotten, replaced by the dark legend of the Time Eater. Many attempted to stop him, but it was a brave vampire hunter who finally succeeded. The hunter, armed with knowledge and courage, confronted Friedrich and ended his unnatural life. As Friedrich fell, his wife Isolde slipped into the shadows, her heart shattered by the consequences of her actions. She was never seen again, and the von Hohenberg estate fell into disrepair, a relic of a dark and twisted history. Back in the present, Damien Knight and Professor Archer were unaware of the full extent of the horrors they were about to uncover. As they approached the old von Hohenberg estate, the echoes of the past lingered in the air, a silent warning of the dangers that awaited. The fight against the Time Eater was not just a battle against a single vampire, but a confrontation with the dark legacies of the past. Damien and Archer knew they had to be prepared for whatever they might face, for the shadows of history were long and filled with vengeful spirits. Chapter 4. Damien Knight and Professor Archer moved cautiously through the overgrown grounds of the von Hohenberg estate. The once grand mansion now stood derelict, its windows shattered and walls crumbling. Shadows seemed to dance around them, the air thick with an unsettling chill. As they entered the old mansion, their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing the decay that had consumed the estate. The halls were silent, save for the creaking of the old floorboards under their feet. They walked through the dilapidated rooms, finding nothing but the remnants of a bygone era. The mansion was a haunting place, with its peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. The scent of mold and dust filled the air, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Each step they took seemed to echo with the ghosts of the past, and the weight of history pressed heavily upon them. When they reached the main hall, something extraordinary happened. The decay and ruin began to fade, replaced by a pristine, grand hall. The walls restored themselves, the chandeliers sparkled, and the room transformed before their eyes. It was as if time itself was rewinding, returning the hall to its former glory. "Archer, what's happening?" Damien asked, his voice tense. "This must be an illusion of some type," Archer replied, his eyes wide with amazement. "No," a voice said, cutting through the air. "This is real." They turned to see a young, beautiful woman entering the grand hall. Her presence was both mesmerizing and chilling. "This is my reality," she said, her voice echoing through the hall. "But it comes at a price." Damien and Archer found themselves unable to move, as if an invisible force held them in place. The woman first approached Archer, her eyes appraising him. "You do not have much time for me to take," she said dismissively. Then she moved to Damien, her gaze intense and curious. "You, however, are different. You have delayed time somehow. I can feel your body's time aging, but at a very slow rate. I could feed off you for years. You may even be strong enough to bring back my Friedrich once more." As she spoke, the room began to decay again, returning to its state of ruin. The woman's face contorted in anger and confusion. "No, how is this possible?" Archer, muttering a simple protection incantation under his breath, had managed to break her hold over them. The vampire, taken by surprise, screamed in frustration. The grand illusion shattered, and the hall reverted to its decrepit state. "Your tricks won't work on us," Damien said, regaining his ability to move. "We're here to end this." The woman's eyes blazed with fury. "You think you can stop me? I have lived for centuries, feeding on the time of others. I will not be defeated by mere mortals." As the tension in the room escalated, Damien and Archer prepared for the confrontation. The Time Eater was powerful, but they had faced many dangers before. With determination and skill, they would find a way to stop her and end the curse that plagued the von Hohenberg estate. The battle for the future had begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 5. At that moment, Damien and Archer heard a blood-curdling scream from outside. The woman's lips curled into a sinister smile. "It's too late," she whispered before disappearing into the shadows. Damien and Archer sprinted towards the source of the scream, their hearts pounding with urgency. They followed the echoes to the crypt of Friedrich von Hohenberg, where they were met with a horrifying sight. Several old women lay on the floor, their once young and healthy bodies now withered and lifeless. "The Time Eater has been capturing and trapping these young women here," Archer said, his voice trembling with disgust. "All to bring back Friedrich." As they entered the crypt, The air grew thick with a malevolent energy. The tomb at the center of the crypt began to crack, the life essence from the women being drawn into the body inside. Standing by the tomb, Isolde watched with a twisted smile on her face. "It has taken centuries and hundreds of lives to finally bring him back," she said, her voice filled with a mad satisfaction. "He is almost strong enough, but he still needs to feed." With that, she held her arms out in a dramatic gesture and sacrificed herself. Her youthful body aged rapidly, transforming into an ancient, decrepit hag. With her last breath, she whispered, "He will restore me when he has finished with you." She collapsed to the ground, her body turning to dust as the tomb shattered open. Standing before Damien and Archer was Friedrich von Hohenberg, his once noble features now half decayed. His eyes glowed with an insatiable hunger as he surveyed his surroundings. Friedrich's gaze fell on Isolde's lifeless form. Understanding her sacrifice, his expression twisted into one of sorrow and rage. He turned his attention to Damien and Archer, his eyes burning with a fierce determination. "I was felled before by your kind, but not this day," he growled, his voice echoing through the crypt. With a roar, Friedrich charged at Damien, grabbing him with a strength that was beyond anything Damien had ever encountered. The force of the impact sent Damien crashing against the wall, the air driven from his lungs. "He's too strong, Archer!" Damien shouted, struggling to free himself from Friedrich's iron grip. Archer, his mind racing, searched for a way to counter the vampire's overwhelming power. The crypt was filled with the echoes of the past and the tangible presence of dark magic. As Friedrich loomed over Damien, ready to drain his life essence, the battle for survival had truly begun. Chapter 6. As Friedrich's grip tightened around Damien's neck, he remembered his training session with his Brazilian jiu-jitsu professor. The old man, with years of wisdom, had managed to defeat him despite Damien's youth, enhanced strength, and aggression. "You rely on strength and power," the professor's voice echoed in his mind. Drawing on those lessons, Damien shifted his body, using leverage and positional advantage to free himself from Friedrich's hold. He rolled away and got to his feet, ready for the next attack. "Wait," Damien said to Archer, who was ready in a spell. "I need to do this." "He's too powerful," Archer screamed. "I know," Damien replied, his eyes locked on Friedrich. "All right, let's do this," he said, bracing himself. Friedrich's supernatural anger fueled his next lunge at Damien. The battle began, with Damien using all his skill and technique rather than brute strength. He dodged, rolled, and countered each of Friedrich's attacks, drawing on every lesson from his training. Despite taking hits and getting trapped several times, Damien managed to escape each time. As the fight wore on, Friedrich's form became more decayed and aged. Archer watched, realizing what Damien was doing. He was fighting time with time. The longer the match continued, the more Friedrich's age caught up with him. The fight seemed to last for hours, but the longer it continued, the more of an edge Damien gained. Each time Friedrich tried to trap and drain Damien's life energy, Damien countered with skill and precision, moving and rolling with the attacks. Friedrich's power started to dwindle significantly. "I must feed," Friedrich screamed, his desperation palpable. He lunged at Archer, but Damien leapt onto his back, sinking in the same chokehold his BJJ professor had used on him. "No!" Friedrich screamed as his body began to vanish, his power failing him. "He's in there." Archer pointed to the tomb as Friedrich's form dissipated. "Let's finish it," Damien said, pushing the tomb lid completely off. Friedrich, now weak and rapidly aging, looked up from the tomb. "No, you must not." "Tell that to these girls," Damien said, dragging Friedrich out of the tomb and continuing the fight. Friedrich, now no match for Damien, weakened with each passing second. "You rely too much on strength and power," Damien said, echoing his professor's words with a final, desperate gasp. Friedrich's body aged and crumbled to dust, unable to sustain itself any longer. The room fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as Friedrich's curse was finally broken. Archer approached, placing a hand on Damien's shoulder. "You did it." Damien nodded, breathing heavily. "We did it. Let's make sure this place never claims another victim." As they left the crypt, the weight of their victory settled over them. They had faced a formidable foe and emerged victorious, not just with strength, but with skill and wisdom. The von Hohenberg estate was finally free from its dark past, and the night seemed a little less dark as they stepped into the dawn of a new day. Chapter 7. Back in the brightly lit Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school, Damien Knight was once again on the mat, facing his BJJ professor. The memory of their last encounter and the lessons learned were fresh in his mind. As they circled each other, Damien focused on using technique and positioning rather than relying on his sheer strength. The professor moved swiftly, his hands reaching for Damien's neck to attempt the same choke that had defeated him before. This time, Damien was ready. He countered with precise movements, defending the choke with a series of calculated maneuvers that allowed him to escape and reverse the position. The professor smiled, a look of approval on his face. "Good," he said, nodding. Before Damien could fully relax, the professor transitioned quickly, catching Damien in another type of lock, a tight armbar that threatened to hyperextend his elbow. Damien winced, feeling the pressure but respecting the professor's superior technique. He tapped out, acknowledging the submission. "You're improving, Damien," the professor said as they stood up. "But remember, there's always more to learn. Technique and skill will always be your greatest assets." Damien nodded, absorbing the wisdom. "Thank you, Professor. I appreciate the lesson." The professor clapped him on the shoulder. "You're a strong fighter, Damien. Keep honing your skills, and you'll continue to grow." Later, as Damien left the school, he reflected on his journey. The battle with Friedrich von Hohenberg had taught him the value of patience, skill, and strategy. He knew that his strength alone would not be enough to face the challenges ahead. His mind and technique had to be as sharp as his physical abilities. Meeting up with Professor Archer at their usual cafe, Damien felt a sense of accomplishment and readiness for whatever came next. "How was training?" Archer asked, looking up from his laptop. "Challenging, but good," Damien replied with a grin. "I managed to defend the choke this time." Archer smiled. "That's great to hear. Speaking of challenges, I've been looking into some new leads. It seems there's always another threat lurking in the shadows." Damien's expression grew serious. "Then let's get to work. There's no rest for the Night Slayer." As they began to discuss their next mission, Damien felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight against darkness was far from over, but with each battle, he became stronger and wiser. The night was their battleground, and they would continue to protect the innocent from the horrors that lurked within it. Chapter 8. In the darkness of a fierce storm, lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the desolate landscape. The wind howled through the trees, and rain pelted the ground with relentless fury. Amidst the chaos, a shrouded figure moved with silent purpose, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. This figure had been tracking Damien Knight for some time, observing his every move from the shadows. It was not an ordinary vampire, but a true vampire, ancient and parasitic. Its presence exuded an aura of pure evil, and its power was palpable even in the raging storm. The vampire's form was gaunt and twisted, its fangs glistening with a predatory hunger. This was the creature that had taken Damien's wife and child, the same one that had bitten Damien, setting him on his path as the Night Slayer. The memory of that night was etched into Damien's soul, a constant reminder of his loss and the darkness he fought against. As the vampire stood in the storm, it spoke in a voice that was both haunting and familiar. "Soon, my creation, we will have to finish our journey." The words carried through the storm, reaching the very core of Damien's being. The vampire's intent was clear, and the threat it posed was undeniable. This was a creature of unimaginable power and cruelty, and it had unfinished business with Damien. Back at the cafe, Damien felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down his spine. He glanced out the window, watching the storm rage outside, a sense of foreboding settling over him. Archer noticed his unease. "Damien, what's wrong?" Damien shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling. "I don't know. Just a bad feeling, I guess." But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The presence of the vampire was something he could sense, a dark connection that he could not ignore. As the storm continued to rage, the vampire's sinister smile grew. It reveled in the fear and chaos it could create, and it was determined to see its plans through to the end. The final confrontation with Damien was approaching, and the vampire was eager to see if its creation could rise to the challenge. The episode ended with the ominous figure of the vampire, standing tall in the storm, a harbinger of the darkness that threatened to engulf Damien once more. The true battle was yet to come, and the fear of what this creature meant to Damien weighed heavily on him. The Night Slayer's journey was far from over, and the greatest test of his strength and resolve was still ahead.